Well, we're your election headquarters, and it is an election night that will go down in the history books in DeSoto County. The Mississippi special election yesterday wasn't just another vote. It was the first time voters cast ballots in a newly created majority black Senate district ordered by a federal court. WRG's Alex Coleman talked with one of the winners who made history.
Let's be clear about what the Supreme Court's ruling means in the real world. A major protection inside the Voting Rights Act has been weakened, and Republican officials are already testing how far they can go. Across the South, state lawmakers are turning their attention toward districts that give black communities meaningful representation in Congress. Mississippi may be the first major warning sign. Governor Tate Reeves has called for dismantling the state's sole majority black House seat, a stunning demand in a state where black residents make up such a significant share of the population. This is not an isolated redistricting dispute. Analysts who closely monitor voting rights believe the same playbook could soon appear in several other Republican-controlled southern states, potentially reshaping representation across the entire region.
DeSoto County, Mississippi, the votes have been counted. For Democrat Teresa Gillespie Isom, her decisive Senate victory was personal and historic.
Yes, it was history being made. First African-American senator, as well as the first female senator in DeSoto County. So it was history.
This election followed court-ordered redistricting.
Let's not pretend this is just another routine fight over procedure. This is a coordinated political strategy, one that follows a pattern rooted in decades of American history. To understand the danger unfolding today, we have to examine where that pattern began. And we do not need to travel very far into the past. As recently as 1970, Louisiana, Georgia, and Mississippi had 0 black representatives in the United States Congress, despite having large and established black communities throughout those states.
In a newly created majority black Mississippi Senate district made their voices heard, electing Isom, who captured 63% of the vote over Republican Charlie Hoots's 37%.
It means that we have had the opportunity now to make sure that the people in DeSoto County have a voice that's a Democratic voice, not that all seats in DeSoto County are Republican.
Black Americans made up about 35% of Mississippi's population, but their political representation remained almost non-existent. That imbalance did not happen by chance. It came from decades of restrictive voting laws, discriminatory redistricting, and a political establishment determined to prevent black citizens from gaining influence in government. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 opened the door to change, but it was the 1,982 amendments that gave the law the stronger legal tools needed to reshape the entire system.
This year, it was a fierce competition for a Senate majority, and it came down to just a handful of seats. The next big thing that Republican senators will do is elect the next majority leader in a secret ballot. It's a big decision because this is turning the page on the Mitch McConnell era in the Senate. The Kentucky Republican has had the longest leadership run in Senate history. The Senate plays a really important role in confirming the president's cabinet. For some of those national security positions, the Senate usually confirms them right after the presidential inauguration on January 20th. The Senate also plays a really important role for judicial nominations, and that will become really clear if there's a vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court.
The amendments established the so-called effects test, allowing discriminatory voting rules to be challenged based on the harm they caused, not just on whether officials openly admitted racist motives. It was a practical response to a very real problem. By the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, Southern governments had become increasingly skilled at preserving racial inequality while hiding behind policies that appeared neutral on paper.
Mississippi Senate Democrats celebrated their efforts to gain 2 more seats.
The momentum that you saw last night was about the power that we have in representing our communities.
According to data from Senator David Blunt, Teresa Isom flipped the seat in District 2 with 63% of the vote.
Southern officials had learned that they could preserve discriminatory results without ever publicly admitting to discriminatory intentions. Instead of defending their policies with explicitly racist language, they relied on mechanisms that appeared ordinary and race-neutral. County-wide voting systems, selective annexations, and redistricting plans that concentrated or divided black communities to reduce their electoral strength. That is exactly why the effects test mattered. It allowed civil rights groups to challenge what a policy actually did, rather than being forced to uncover a written confession of bias. The 1,982 amendments were also hardly an extreme proposal. They passed Congress with bipartisan backing, reflecting a broad national understanding that discrimination could survive even when its authors became more careful about how they described it.
Victory that we are celebrating today is certainly a direct result of the federal courts here in Mississippi ruling that the district lines needed to be redrawn.
Senator Daniel Sparks says he's not in favor of the districts being drawn by the courts.
That's not something that I prefer. I believe the legislature should have the job of doing that. It obviously changes the dynamic when you look at voting populations and districts that you run in.
Sparks says Republicans plan to work with all new members to keep Mississippi moving forward. At the state capitol, Cameron Smith, 12 News.
Now, Democrats now hold 18 of the 52 seats in the state Senate. Republicans hold 34, which is less than the 2/3 majority needed to ram through legislation without bipartisan support. The Mississippi Republican Party called last night's results disappointing, but not unexpected. In a statement, party chairman Mike Hurst said, quote, "The Democrats' wins yesterday were the equivalent of scoring points in the fourth quarter while losing the game in a blowout. It doesn't change the conservative direction or policies in our state legislature." End quote.
Mississippi's special election may look like a small state-level story, but the power shift it produced is not small at all. A federal court ordered new district lines, voters elected additional Democrats, and the balance inside the state Senate changed. Republicans still hold the majority, but with 34 of 52 seats, they are now below the 2/3 threshold required for certain high-stakes votes. Democrats, with 18 seats, can no longer be ignored on constitutional amendments, budget measures, and resolutions demanding more than a simple majority. Republican officials tried to wave the result away, arguing that Democrats had merely scored a few points while still losing the larger game. But if those points determine whether major legislation advances, then the scoreboard matters. The deeper story is how those districts came into existence. The victory followed a federal ruling that Mississippi's old map had to be redrawn. Democrats see that intervention as proof that courts remain essential when legislatures design districts that deny communities a meaningful voice. Republicans argue that elected lawmakers, not judges, should control redistricting. But that argument is hard to accept when the lawmakers drawing the map are also the politicians benefiting from it. Redistricting can decide elections before voters ever reach the polls. This is why the 1,982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act mattered. They allowed courts to examine discriminatory effects, not only explicit statements of racist intent. That standard became a target for conservative lawyers, including John Roberts during his years in the Reagan Justice Department. Roberts argued that the amendments went too far, Congress rejected that view, and passed the changes with bipartisan support. Yet the legal philosophy Roberts championed followed him all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, the court has delivered a Louisiana ruling that critics say severely damages the last effective enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act. The majority did not announce that it was canceling the 1,982 amendments. It narrowed the standard until bringing a successful challenge may become extraordinarily difficult. On paper, the law survives. In practice, the tool that made it useful is being stripped away. If plaintiffs cannot rely on discriminatory results, they may have to prove that lawmakers consciously intended to discriminate. But modern officials rarely record themselves saying their goal is to weaken Black or Latino voting power. They use race-neutral language, claim partisan necessity, and build technical justifications around maps that still produce predictable racial outcomes. The effects test existed because Congress understood this. Removing it does not eliminate discrimination. It makes discrimination easier to disguise and harder to challenge. The court's approach is also controversial. Critics argue that the justices addressed a question the parties were not actively fighting over. The majority did not merely resolve the dispute before it. It found an opening to settle a broader ideological issue. That is the kind of behavior conservative judges have long attacked as activism when liberal courts were accused of doing it. The majority also moved away from recent precedent, creating the impression that consistency matters only until it blocks the desired result. This is why calls for Supreme Court reform cannot be dismissed as partisan frustration. The concern is not merely that conservatives are winning cases. The concern is that the majority appears willing to weaken bipartisan statutes, bypass precedent, and decide questions beyond the immediate dispute. When judges repeatedly reshape national policy that way, confidence in the institution begins to collapse. The damage will not be limited to Washington. Voting Rights Act protections influence maps for state legislatures, county commissions, city councils, school boards, and elected courts. Black communities in southern states could lose districts that finally gave them an opportunity to elect responsive representatives. Latino communities across the Southwest face the same danger. These groups need systems in which their votes can realistically produce representation. The urgency becomes clearer when we turn to Ohio. For years, Ohio was America's favorite swing state test. Then, Trump rebuilt its political identity around working-class voters, rural communities, economic nationalism, and frustration with deindustrialization. By 2024, he carried 81 of 88 counties. Republicans looked unbeatable, but heading into 2026, Democrats believe the state may be competitive again. Ohio has not suddenly become liberal. Instead, some voters who trusted Trump no longer believe his promises improved their lives. In Mahoning County, once a Democratic labor stronghold and later a symbol of Trump's blue-collar appeal, the visible enthusiasm has diminished. The signs, flags, and hats that once dominated the landscape are less common. That does not prove a statewide realignment, but it suggests the intensity behind Trump may be weakening. Lordstown gives that disappointment a physical address. Trump told workers that manufacturing jobs were returning and urged them not to sell their home. General Motors closed its assembly plant anyway, wiping out the economic center of the community. Foxconn arrived with another promise, yet its facility operates far below the scale residents expected and without the union jobs many considered essential. Ultium Cells offered a battery manufacturing future, but shutdowns and layoffs again left families waiting for stability. This is why Trump's tariff message faces a credibility test. Tariffs were supposed to protect domestic production and create American jobs. Some unions supported that logic even while endorsing Democrats, but workers say they have not seen the promised surge. The employment numbers cited in the report show manufacturing and auto jobs moving downward, not upward. The question for voters is becoming brutally simple. Where is the revival? Economic disappointment is only one source of defections. A veteran who once moved from the Tea Party into Trump's movement now supports Democrats because he fears MAGA is undermining constitutional institutions. Another former Trump supporter, also an Iraq veteran, says the prospect of war with Iran reopened memories of conflicts political leaders entered confidently while others endured the consequences. He is pro-military, but he does not believe that requires being casual about war. These voters matter because Democrats cannot win Ohio merely by energizing people who already agree with them. They must persuade people who voted for Trump 2 or 3 times. Rising costs may give them that opening. When wages fail to keep pace with housing, food, and energy bills, political identity collides with economic reality. Democrats want the midterms to become a referendum on one question. After all, the promise is your life more secure? That question also explains the assault on voting rights protections. Critics believe a party worried about losing persuasion battles may try to secure power through district maps and election rules, yet the strategy carries a hidden risk. The same protections preserving minority representation in the South have also limited Democratic mapmakers in blue states. If those constraints collapse, New York, Illinois, and California could draw more aggressive maps of their own. Republicans may celebrate a short-term victory only to unleash a redistricting war in which both parties abandon restraint. Democrats will then have to decide whether to defend fair representation or fight power with power.